Indenture was a system that claimed the Indians as equal beneficiaries, extolled as being philanthropic to the plight of the agricultural population living in the overcrowded tracts of India. As Major Pitcher stated, it was a godsend to a weary soul, providing them with good sufficient food, with complete rest and wages, in a congenial climate free from famine and cholera. The Indian in this narrative is portrayed as helpless and hopeless against overpopulation, famine, and disease. The personal narratives of the indentured Indians remain largely undocumented. Oral history, where sentimentality should be seen as an instrument of truth, rescues the Indian from this obscurity. Vignettes of their lives, of what they did and what they wanted to do, expressed in recognizable, repetitive ways, challenge the notion of them being equal beneficiaries. Official records infer that Rani and her family entered willingly into a contract as indentured laborers to Natal, leaving their home of disease, drought, and chose to permanently settle in the colony. However, her oral history of her life as an Indian woman serving her indenture speaks of deception, displacement, the desperation to return, abuse, and death. The extent of such institutionalized deception that displaced the Indian to the colony of Natal remains undetermined. Natal was a colony that was hostile to the permanent settlement of Indians and notorious for abuses towards them. The colony introduced unjust laws that would force the free Indian to re-indenture or return to India. Their transition from Indian to indenture hybridized their identity. The feeling of shame attached to this and the air of independence of people who had seen the world would make reintegration into India difficult and for some impossible. And the hostility they faced in the colony would leave the indentured Indian insecure about their tenuous connection with either place. Their Indian identity was unquestionable, a synthesis of religion, caste, and culture. It was a social system sustained by strong familial and kinship bonds that would keep them bound to India. The indenture system, at the very least, was that it removed them from India. At the very least, that it removed them from India was an anathema to this. The Indian largely refused to be drawn into this ambiguous and polluting space, despite being tempted by the promise of financial security in the colony. And that made recruitment for the colonies, even at times of famine and distress, difficult. In 1906, the northwestern province of India was in the throes of another famine, and it was the year that Rani was indentured to Natal, and the colony had requested for 12,760 Indians that year, and only half of this was supplied by the end of 1908, 2 years later. Deception played a purposeful role in recruiting and displacing Indians to the colonies. Institutionalized deception seeking legitimacy from the contract between the government and the Indian, the appointment of licensed recruiters and protectors indicated that the deception went deeper than the recruiting stages, where recruiters would lure Indians into registering under false promises. The illiterate, untraveled peasant thrown into a system masquerading as philanthropic would have little recourse to challenge and document this sham. Rani had come from the Jalaun district, classified by the British as a backward tract with limited natural water sources. The peasant farmer also suffered due to expanding British economic policy that saw the gradual decrease of markets in Jalaun, unequal and excessive revenue assessments, and the replacement of locally grown dyes with synthetic ones. Famine, disease, and prosperity were part of the fabric of her life. Despite the adversity, there was a general rise in the population in the decade thereafter. She was born at a time when cholera and fever claimed many lives, and as a toddler survived the scarcity of 1887. And during the famine of 1895-96, she was married. The land, flat to the horizon, is where the peasant's world ended, except if visiting a neighboring fair or market, or the occasional wedding or visiting family in contiguous tracts. The peasant farmer's life centered around their fields and villages, covered in fog in winter and blazing hot in summer. She was a descendant of people who had inhabited the region of Bundelkhand, the imposing Gharkundar fort still standing today as testimony to their tradition of former greatness. After the hot winds of March and April, the rains are expected normally, and towards the end of June are frequently delayed. Preparing for the burst of rains, the cultivators assemble and conduct a ceremony. In this region of India, the Kharif harvest of grains provides the peasant with roti, their staple food for the coming year. The year that she had left, the rains had failed. The soil had hardened and caked, and the kharif seeds failed to take. The village tank had run dry, grain reserves were depleted, and cattle were the first to die due to scarcity of fodder. Government relief works opened and village tanks were built. Village wages were paid in part food and cash. Despite this, many migrated to less affected districts. History had shown that years later, many migrants of previous decades would be attracted back to their homes by prosperity. In 1905, famine saw half the population of her district on the move. Found in consensus reports of other districts of the United Provinces and in greater numbers in other parts of India. Only the men would migrate, as respectable men would not expose their wives to risks that they are unaware of. Defying her husband and caste norms, Rani left the village, baby in arms, and followed him. As she walked away from her modest home and the dry tank, along narrow pathways that blended seamlessly with the dusty bare fields, past skeletons of trees and in the cold winter air, with the expectation of returning when the famine ended, she walked away from her anonymity as an Indian woman and into the annals of imperial history. Not too far away, she was reunited with her husband, and while resting on the side of a road, a recruiter for Natal spotted them. Both would earn him recruitment fees, she more than her husband. They were at the beginning of desperation, not emaciated yet, and would easily pass the medical test. He fabricated an offer of work in Calcutta. Rani would not have seen him, the loose end of her sari pulled over her head and face, but his words would convince them that they were fortunate enough to be saved from hunger and cold. This recruitment strategy was repeated throughout that year, to such an extent that the protector of immigrants at Calcutta wrote to the commissioner of police that recruiters persuaded immigrants by promising them employment in Calcutta. Many years before this, the Indians had carried a similar story to Natal. Saunders, a general storekeeper on an estate there, testified to the Rag Commission that a good many Indians have been deceived by recruiters in India. They are first misled into going to Calcutta for work, and when they arrive at the depot, the Calcutta agent tells them what they really have to do, and they are ashamed to return home again. Competition and commission made it impossible for recruiters to earn a decent living. It was plenty of money in 1 month and death the next, and they would recruit any coolie they could get hold of. A recruiter from Benares said in 1902, "I have given up my business as immigration sub-agent because the business provided a losing one, as I would not descend to the low tricks and malpractices of the trade." At Jhansi Magistrate Court, a building of brick and lime with jack-arched walls and tiny windows, Rani would stand bare feet on the flagstone floors, baby in arms, her husband by her side, facing the European magistrate. The magistrate was to inform the Indian of the type of employment and that they were agreeing to, and apart from other formalities, detect deception. Relying heavily on the verbal representations of first the recruiter and then the magistrate, the family would be contractually bound to the colony of Natal. The magistrate was to, apart from other formalities, detect deception, but Pitcher found that magistrates were too busy with trials to properly follow the registration process. Furthermore, Pitcher also found that the nervousness of the coolie and the difficulty of catching right away the accent of the foreigners who addresses him as other reasons why deception went undetected. The agreement reached at Jhansi that day with the magistrate acting on behalf of the Natal government stated that they were to be employed in agriculture, a term that was differently interpreted by both contracting parties. For the Indian farmer, agriculture was a routine of rest and work, growing seasonal rotational crops. Festivals, rituals, reverence, and hardships all arose from agriculture. In reality, in Natal, agriculture meant a life of unremitting labor for rations and wages that were paid irregularly. As an Indian testified, they were treated like a bull buffalo, driven by sardars and managers, and forced to work late hours during crushing season. The term agriculture was removed and replaced by the term laborer in Natal on arrival. The protector of immigrants defined laborer as being equivalent to a worker. This allowed Indians to be employed as house servants and other occupations that they were unaccustomed to and was forbidden by their caste. Tara Singh, a Brahmin, complained that I object to handling beef, carrying slops, and other general work repulsive to my caste. Besides increasing the scope of term laborer, the Indian Immigration Trust Board in Natal illegally employed Indians as minors. The government of India had stipulated that indenture was granted to the colony for agricultural purposes. It was only years later that permission was granted, and prior to this, many agricultural workers were recruited in India to work underground amongst the gloom and din of the tramming roads. Many of the Indians died within the period of indenture employed in the coal mines of fires underground. The incongruent perceptions of the term agricultural labor in the minds of the Indians on the contract, unless clarified by recruiters and magistrates, who themselves were probably unaware of the discrepancy in Natal, meant that none of the Indians knew in India who they were to be employed by and a description of their work. At the depot in Garden Reach, sites of life in India blocked off by high walls, the shame of women violated by medical examinations for venereal disease and other identified marks left unspoken. As the steamship's Amzinto, a native name, the first sign of a foreign land, sailed on board with no means of pacifying the goddess of smallpox, Sheetalama, the Indians may have been filled with fear of suffering a similar fate as a fellow passenger. The third cook committed suicide, and the feeling of hunger had returned as rations on board given were short. Many single females on board had no next of kin. Was it because their families had perished in the famine, or were family names not given because of the women's shame or the recruiter's guile? What did the Indians on the Amzinto speak about? Did they talk of the lives left behind or the uncertainty of what was to come? Or did they speak at all? Did their minds and hearts remain steadfast to their caste prejudices on the rolling and pitching of the Kala Pani? On board were a few returnee families from Suriname, Demerara, and Fiji. Had the Demerara residents intended to go to Demerara and had missed the last ship out before close of the season? Why were they returning? Did they know that they were going to be employed in mines, an occupation foreign to all they knew of India and Demerara? Returnees from Fiji and Suriname, were they substituted for others? Were they taken from other depots to make up the numbers on embarkation? Did Janki, a single mother with child, reflect bravery or desperation? And did the returnee stories fill the others with dread of hope of life in the colony, dread of hope of life or a better life in the colony? For the passengers on Amzinto, it was when the ship docked in Natal, it was a time of separation from their ship friends. They had landed in a colony where their fellow countrymen would be called coolies, despite the law recognizing them as Indians. They would further be called, the Indian men would be called Sammy and the woman Mary. It was a colony where Indian laborers complained of the use of shambok, a piece of bullock's hide about 1.5 feet long. Public displays of corruption and impunity of the Indian Immigration Trust Board and employees of Indians by way of government-sanctioned commissions and court cases would do little to change the circumstances of the laborer. When indenture finally ended, the Natal planters a year later disregarded the government of India's directives again and sent recruiters to India to illegally recruit for Natal. The Natal government had demonstrated little regard for their agreements with the government of India during the history of indenture to the colony. The Indian indenture would therefore stand little chance of their contract being honored. Cruelty was justified on the basis of European opinion of Indians as carriers of disease, vices coming from low-class backgrounds. The disregard of the Indian's caste inadvertently freed the Indian from the bondage of caste that repressed originality of thought and freedom of action, and they were able to venture into employment of their choice. The Natal trader squatting inside his shop among grain bags and ledgers was the potter and not the Jain or Banya as in India. The European also found that there was less likelihood of pauperism amongst coolies in Natal. The introduction of the 3-pound tax in 1895 was a way of curbing the economic threat that the Indian posed to the settler white population. Many Indians struggled to pay this, and this forced them to return to India, while others who had nothing to return to, like the Indian woman who was found dead, as she was forced to close her shop because of the inability to pay the tax. En route to the plantation, Rani would have passed an acre of land set aside for burial of Indians. 20 yards from the graveyard was a slaughterhouse from which pigs uprooted the bodies interned in shallow graves. Europeans found cremation repulsive. The green undulating fields of the coastline, the breaker views as well, were foreign to her. Familiar sights of the acacia tree that also grew in the plains of Bundelkhand, the cheeky chirp of the Indian miner, and the vegetables like gourd and lentils brought from India germinating in foreign soil. She would meet South Indians for the first time who looked like her but whose language and customs were different to hers. The regional differences would result in a lack of social cohesion. Indians held on to caste wherever possible, refusing communal bathrooms and toilets, and the objection to taking water from the hands of persons not of his own caste. The coolie barracks was the only place in which the Indian could recreate the India they left behind. Unlike in India, social activities would include exchanging political news of Gandhi and the rumors that he would have them jailed if they chose to re-indenture. In hushed tones, they would complain about the Sardar and managers, and at other times protecting each other, raising money to buy the freedom of Sikh Indians, like Durga, whose leg was amputated and was forced to work, and sharing stories of Sharan, the owner who had died a few months before Rani arrived. He was a man who loved his family and named his estate and daughter after his late mother. The Indians did not speak of his success and position of respect amongst the planter community in Natal, but rather of how they knew him, his abusive ways, and alleged rape of an Indian woman. His son-in-law, Chalet, would manage the estate before and after his death, using whatever came to hand, ropes, sticks, and at other times his hands and legs to beat the Indian. Fined for assault with numerous other complaints from Indian men and women, he continued to manage the estate with virtual impunity. They would sleep and awake to the dark shadows of the hills and feel an intense loneliness, praying across the ocean to their village godlings, indulging in drink and behavior that would take away their self-respect and morality and the resulting shame that would prevent them from returning home. Some intoxicated with dacha, listless eyes, glassy and suffused with vacant stares, the sensation as if the body would fly over the cane fields. The coolie barracks would be nothing like the village she had left behind. The women working in the fields exposed to all weathers, leaving at 5 a.m. and returning home after dark too tired to cook. This routine deprived the little children of attendance. Employees were obliged to erect and provide shelters and accommodation for children of working women in fields. Sham sickness or humbug sickness and the habit of the coolie feigning sickness to avoid work was seen as the greatest difficulty faced by planters. In the absence of a medical man, the manager or employer of an estate is compelled to judge for himself whether the illness complained is real or feigned. While working in the fields, Rani's son went astray and had to be found. The manager, Chalet, would hit her for being an unfit mother. And on another occasion, when of being ill and unable to work, he would hit her again and force her back to the fields for what he thought was sham sickness. The next day after the beating, she lay dying in her hut. Did she imagine herself boarding a ship back to India, taking a train from Calcutta to Jhansi, and walking the metalled and unmetalled roads back to the village? Passing the village shrine, sitting in her angan where, with dexterous turns of her wrist, sifting grain free of dirt, playing with her baby in the sun, speaking Bundeli with the ladies at the well, not mentioning to anyone her physical contact with Europeans, the medical examination and the blows. Visiting her father as his Bitiya Rani had returned, and not a coolie woman. Her life instead ended in a foreign land, her body buried unceremoniously in an unmarked grave. In India, her body would have been dressed as a bride, a laddu in her hand, covered in a white cloth, and with chants of Ram Nam taken away to the village cremation grounds, and her ashes immersed in the river nearby. In the colony, in a shallow, unmarked grave, Rani's story ended. Her story was very much like the passengers on the Red Riding Hood who had complained of deception, displacement, and abuse in the 1870s. Unlike them, Rani had not survived indenture. She was not an equal beneficiary to the system. In fact, she was not a beneficiary at all. Thank you.